Hey, everybody, and welcome to my weekly webinar. Today is June the 15th, 2024. Sorry for the technical problems last Saturday, but we're back. And we're going to look at Elizabeth Taylor, world famous beauty actress, and her 8 marriages. And so we're going to look at all of that. We're going to focus on Richard Burton, because she married him twice. He was husband number 5 and husband number 6. Okay. Elizabeth Taylor is a Pisces. Her moon is in passionate Scorpio, and she has a Sagittarius rising. With a Sag rising, there's all that generosity and optimism, world traveling. That's all that Jupiter or Sag. Sag is ruled by Jupiter. So Jupiter is her ruling planet. Jupiter is all that prosperity and opportunity and luck. Her Jupiter is in the 8th house. The 8th house is the house sector of wealth. Her Jupiter is at 15 Leo and forming a trine, the best flow of energy to that Sag rising at 13 Sag. So all that prosperity and luck and also fame with Jupiter flows easily through her ascendant, how she interacts with the world. Venus is the planet of love and beauty. So you got to really look at that. And Venus is at 17 Aries, a fire sign. So what we have here is a grand trine, which is the most auspicious of all the energies, the luckiest energies. And it goes from her ruling planet Jupiter in that 8th house. The 8th house is also the house of sexuality, and she had all that sensuality and it larger than life with the Jupiter. But I also often, with the 8th house, people come into inheritance, they come into settlements, they come into wealth with all that lucky Jupiter. And the Jupiter is trining the ascendant, how she's seen by the world, how she interacts with the world. And Venus, the planet of love and beauty and creativity, is in Aries, the 3rd fire sign. So it's got a fire grand trine. That's all that inspiration, all that passion. Now, Venus, let's start with Venus is the planet of beauty. Venus is that planet of love, creativity, and beauty. And she has that Venus in the grand trine. Venus is trining the ascendant. The ascendant can describe not only the personality, but it can describe the physical appearance. And the ruling planet is Jupiter, which is trining her ascendant. And so there's well, first of all, the Jupiter rules the physical body, and it rules the ascendant that rules the physical body. And that Jupiter is in the best flow of energy to the ascendant. So it's really supporting that whole persona. And Venus, that planet of beauty, is in harmony with the ascendant that rules the physical body, but also in a trine to Jupiter, the ruler of the 1st house of the physical body, and that brings in that grand trine. Venus, let's go before we get to all these marriages. Venus is that planet of creativity. And she's a Pisces, and Pisces can be very uh, emotional and sensitive and creative. Her sun is conjuncting Mercury. Well, let's say exactly at 7 degrees of Pisces. And the time of birth that's on record for her, that's supposedly pretty good, is the cusp of the third house of communications and acting is at 7 degrees of Pisces. So that Sun Mercury, first of all, a Sun Mercury person has lots of ideas, is a communicator, a spokesperson, but it's all shining in the third house of communications and acting. Where the acting comes from, starting with the Pisces is ruled by Neptune. Neptune is all this dreamy, romantic, imaginative. Neptune rules film and fantasy and creativity. And Neptune is the ruler of Pisces. But that Neptune is at 6.5 degrees of Virgo. It's almost a perfect opposition to the sun and Mercury. The opposition is how the world is seeing her. Well, with that Neptune, there's this whole illusion, this creativity, and the Neptune is on the cusp, going into the beginning, the strongest point of the 9th house of media, marketing, publishing. Now, to continue with the acting, because that Sun Mercury in the 3rd house of acting, and she's a creative, sensitive Pisces. Pisces can lose themselves in their roles, lose themselves in their relationships, but it all is aspected strongly by dreamy, creative Neptune. Now let's look to Venus, the planet of creativity. Her Venus is 17 Aries, and it's all part of the Grand Trine. But she has Uranus at 17 Aries. So her Venus exactly conjuncts Uranus. That Venus-Uranus is this original, charismatic, creative energies. And it's all part of the Grand Trine. So there's all this creative energies. The sun, or Venus at 17 Aries, not only is it part of the Grand Trine, but it's squaring, forming a 9-degree angle to Pluto. So that Venus-Pluto, there's these strong desires and passions, but it can also, when we're starting to segue into relationships, Venus, Uranus are people who fall in love very quickly. And it's here today, gone tomorrow. She's all in with, especially with Aries, she gets really excited about anybody new. And it's all being aspected by Pluto. Pluto is that compulsiveness. Pluto can be these intense obsessions and power struggles to her love life. Now, the 8 marriages. Well, the 7th house of marriage is Gemini, because it's opposite her Sag rising. And the rising sign describes your personality, your identity. The opposite is the others that you attract into your life. And with Gemini, there aren't any planets in her 7th house of marriage, but it's ruled by Gemini. And Gemini is all this restlessness, fickleness, needing a lot of mental stimulation. Mercury is the ruling planet of her 7th house of marriage. Mercury can also be needing lots of variety. The Mercury is exactly conjuncting the sun. So it puts a real emphasis on all that, the desire for variety. But the big thing here is that the Mercury, ruler of the seventh house of marriage, is opposite Neptune, dreamy, romantic Neptune. I would say, and I've seen this in many charts, that she falls in love with love. She is incredibly romantic, but she's not dealing, she's dealing more with fantasy and romanticism and not reality. And she jumps in very, very quickly. That's the Venus Uranus. And that she's going to have all kinds of people attracted to her because of that Venus, the grand trine to the Jupiter. Jupiter just brings in all this growth and opportunity. Now, the wealth, she became a very wealthy woman for being a major movie star. As I recall now, when she did Cleopatra in, was it the mid 60s, 64, 65? As I recall now, she was paid $1 million. That was the most money any actress had ever made. And then she kept going through all these divorces. So she keeps collecting all these diamonds. But the wealth is that Jupiter in the eighth house, being the ruling planet and being part of the grand trine, often the eighth house has a lot to do with inheritance, and certainly financial gifts. Now, her first husband, I think when she was like 20, was Nicky Hilton. That's the first son, the first eldest son of Conrad Hilton, the founder of the Hilton hotel chain. And Conrad Hilton was, of course, very wealthy. And Nicky was his first son. He died at 42 from heart disease, from a heart attack due to alcoholism. All of that, I mean, there was just so much excess when you're born into all that wealth. He was reportedly a major playboy. And where that would come from is he has a Gemini rising with the moon and Venus and Gemini on the ascendant. That moon is all that, these emotional feelings and attachments to love, all that desire of the Venus. And now, his wealth is his sun in Cancer was conjuncting Pluto. Sun Pluto is all this attracting a lot of power in the sector of money. And it was all forming a trine to business Saturn. And Jupiter was in his 10th house of careers that can give a great deal of luck and success and fame. Now, what was going on? I think their marriage, as I recall, was only about a year. And Nicky's Mars is at 14 Aries, and Elizabeth's Venus is at 17 Aries. So when you have a Venus-Mars conjunction, there can also be a strong sexual attraction. Also, Liz's Mars is in a hard angle, a square to Nicky's Venus. So his Mars is impacting her Venus. his Venus is impacting her Mars. This was a strong physical, sexual attraction, but she wouldn't have gotten her needs met. It would have just been sexual. And he's so wealthy and famous because of his father. And Elizabeth is becoming one of the most beautiful and famous actresses on the planet. And so it was all that outer external physical energies. But Elizabeth's moon is in Scorpio, 15 Scorpio. And Nikki Hilton's Saturn, taskmaster, restricted, cold Saturn, is 19 Scorpio. So she was, after the initial tremendous excitement and sexual attraction, he was, as she was trying to get bonded, trying to fall in love, trying to make that fantasy a reality, it was hitting a brick wall. And so there was this coldness to Nikki because he also was supposedly, as I mentioned, a player. He was always cheating and playing and meeting women because of his fame and his wealth, because of his father. And Elizabeth Taylor was very depressed about it because that's her moon, her emotional bonding being blocked by his Saturn. So it only lasted a year. And then we get to Richard Burton. So if anybody is live, check in, say hello, let me know who you are. All right. So Richard Burton was the great romance of her life, supposedly, that they loved each other so much they got married twice. And where that comes from is that Elizabeth's Venus in the Grand Trine with Uranus, or with Uranus in the fiery Aries, she falls in love too quickly. And she falls in love with the whole fantasy of love and romance. But that Venus is trining the best flow of energy to her Neptune. Neptune's all that dreaminess. Richard's Venus is in Capricorn, for Capricorn, and it's in a trine to Liz's dreamy Neptune. So her Venus to his Neptune, and his Venus to her Neptune, both in the same trine, is incredibly romantic. But Richard also has that Saturn in Scorpio, like Nikki Hilton, and there's a coldness, a detachment to Richard, especially as the Saturn, his Saturn is 17 Scorpio, and his Sun is 17 Scorpio. So, and it's part of a grand trine. That Sun Saturn is trining Uranus, trining Pluto. The positive is he would have been very hardworking and responsible in investing his monies, and had this good business sense. But personally, when the Sun, the identity, is aligned with Saturn, there's a detachment, there's a coldness. It's all work, kind of like this, very guarded. And that Sun Saturn is the exact opposite Um, Elizabeth's emotional moon in Scorpio. Now, when the moon of the female is aligned with the sun of the male, that is the number one best compatibility combination. Just having the sun and the moon in harmony is this bonding, because the moon wants family and nurturing, and the sun what lights you up. But Richard Burton's sun is 17 Scorpio, and Elizabeth Taylor's moon is 15 Scorpio. So there's a perfect sun moon alignment. And it's always best if it's the woman with the moon and the man with the sun. But Richard Burton is a Sun Saturn personality. So there's this detachment, this coldness, but there's this tremendous romantic attraction with a Venus Neptune to both of their charts. And then having her moon conjuncting his Saturn or his sun, there's this incredible bonding, but the Saturn is there. And there's a certain amount of detachment and coldness. And when we're looking at Richard Burton's chart, he has an Aries rising. He's overly independent. He's very fiery, impatient. Mars is the ruling planet. Mars is the warrior planet. And he has that ruling planet, feisty Mars, in the 7th house of marriage. That Mars can certainly indicate that that potential for being very argumentative, maybe being verbally abusive. Remember whatever happened to Virginia Woolf, and these two people were screaming and hollering at each other through the whole movie, and that would also, but they can't live with each other and can't live without each other. They have this incredible connection, but Richard Burton has that fiery, argumentative Mars ruling planet in that 7th house of marriage. Now, also Richard Burton's moon is 9 Virgo, almost exact opposite Elizabeth's sun, and Mercury at 7 Pisces. So Liz's sun is opposite his moon, and Elizabeth's moon is exactly conjunct Richard's sun. This is an amazing connection, which is why they got married twice. But also, Elizabeth can also be very high strung, and so is Richard. And Richard is very stubborn with that Scorpio energy and that Sun Saturn. But in some ways, they were ideal. They were soulmates, if you will. And yet with that Sun Saturn, it was all business for him, or all formality to him. There was this body armor to him. And Elizabeth is a Pisces. She wants to melt into the person, become one, lose herself in with her partner. And she couldn't do it with Nikki because he has that body armor of Saturn to her moon. And Richard Burton has the same Saturn, but everything in the chart of Richard Burton to Elizabeth is kind of astrologically what soulmates and romantic marriage is all about. But she wasn't getting her needs met. That's that moon in Scorpio. And moon in Scorpio people can be very obsessive, possessive, controlling, demanding, and And Richard Burton just has this Saturn, which is all part of his identity, with his sun next to Saturn. And so again, she would have been so frustrated because they were so connected. Um, they were they really believed that we're each other's soulmate, I am sure. But it's Richard's upbringing or his formality that he couldn't really open up. And Elizabeth is very this all or nothing demanding person with that moon in Scorpio, and it slams up against Richard's Saturn. And so and then there was all that fighting, because also his Mars, the ruling planet of his chart, in the seventh house of marriage. So he's always argumentative and fighting and could be physically, but certainly verbally abusive. But that Mars is at the very end of Libra, so it's almost 0 degrees of Scorpio. And that is forming a square by 2 degrees to Elizabeth's Saturn. So he was trying to get his needs met and being aggressive and being assertive, Mars, and Elizabeth's Saturn just put the clamps on. So there would have just been all this anger and frustration and disappointments because they were so deeply in love and they both were so flawed, and they divorced. Then they got married again because of this incredible connection. Let's look at fame. And we already I mentioned about Elizabeth's strong third house of acting, influenced by Neptune, film, fantasy, the imagination. With Richard Burton, he has Venus, that planet of creativity, at the beginning, which is the strongest point of his 10th house of careers. So there's this, he works well with the public, that Venus, could be very popular with Venus, but that Venus is very much emphasized, all that creativity in his career sector. The moon represents one's public needs and public persona. In Richard Burton's chart, it's 9 Virgo, and it's trining the best flow of energy to his Jupiter. Moon Jupiter can bring in recognition, success, fame, and Elizabeth Taylor's moon is at 15 Scorpio, forming a tight 90-degree angle to square to her ruling planet Jupiter at 15 Leo. When the moon and Jupiter are making a very strong connection in the chart, that can bring in a lot of success and luck, but fame, because the moon can represent that public persona. Jupiter is all that expansiveness. And the moon, her moon is also trining the best flow of energy to Pluto. So there's all that drive and passion. She has an extraordinary chart for fame, for wealth, for beauty. And it's so connected with Richard Burton. And yet they had the Saturn Her Saturn blocks his aggressive Mars. His Saturn blocks her emotional moon. So they were ill-fated lovers. Now, any questions? Certainly. Good morning, Paul. Glad you're here. All of those marriages was, as I've already mentioned, she's very romantic and falls in love with love. And with her love planet Venus in Aries, she's always jumping in very quickly. And with Uranus, Venus, it's here today and gone tomorrow. But it's also the Venus-Uranus is in a hard angle to compulsive controlling Pluto. So she falls in love very quickly, and then it becomes a whole big mess. How does she get out of it? And then she immediately divorces, and boom, she's madly in love with the idea and the fantasy, and it starts all over again. Elizabeth Taylor has Saturn, taskmaster Saturn, in the second house of income. But with her ruling planet Jupiter in the 8th house of inheritance and wealth, part of the grand trine, it's interesting that the Saturn is in the second house of income, because she started making all kinds of monies. She was 12 years old and she did National Velvet. And so there's always been this fame, there's always been this money. That's that incredible grand trine to Venus and Jupiter. But Saturn in the second house of income. I always joke around that if you got Saturn in the second house, you end up dying with money in the bank. But Saturn, where Saturn is, it always feels like it's not enough. And there's a bit of a poverty consciousness with that Saturn in the second. Got to make more money. I'm going to run out of money. But then she acquired all this incredible wealth because she couldn't stop working. She couldn't stop obsessing. And all that obsession, which is also Moon in Scorpio, and with the Moon in harmony with Pluto, the ruler of Scorpio, that could be also her addiction to romance and getting married. Now, it looks like there's only Paul. Are there any questions? Any comments? If not, I've touched upon everything. Guess I'm just looking around, anything else I can say, but it's all like really supporting everything I've already said. So sorry about last week. And I hope to see more of you online interacting with questions and comments next Saturday. All the best.